I want to be clear about something before this story goes any further. I am not a woman who was rescued. A man I had never met pulled me out of a crime scene his organization created, installed me in a safe house, and accidentally made me indispensable to his entire criminal empire. That's the short version. The long version involves a data breach, a traitor, a permanent leg injury, and a series of conversations that happened too late at night to be entirely professional. But none of that is what I want to talk about first. What I want to talk about is the word rescued, because people are going to want to use it, and I need it on the record that it's wrong. I was pulled from debris, yes. I was dependent on a man I didn't know, in a city that had just tried to kill me, with a leg that would never work quite right again. That is not rescue. In his world, man, it became my world faster than I'd like to admit. The only thing that actually keeps you safe is being useful. I was useful. What nobody warned me about was what happens when useful becomes something else entirely, something neither of us had a clean word for, something that complicated every logical, sensible, self-preserving instinct the two of us had. I'm going to tell you the long version. Try to keep up. Seoul doesn't lower its voice for anyone. That's the thing I'd learned in 8 months of living inside it. The city just keeps going. All neon and exhaust and the smell of rain on hot pavement, utterly indifferent to what's happening to any one person moving through it. I used to find that freeing, the anonymity of a place that has no interest in your story. I'd come here on a 6-month contract, extended it once, then again telling myself it was the work, a cybersecurity consulting project that kept finding new layers every time I thought I was close to the bottom of it. The truth was simpler and less flattering. Going home felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, that the life I'd built there had stopped fitting me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Seoul asked me no questions. I stayed. The night it happened, I was walking back from a client site, earphones in, brain already halfway through a problem I'd been turning over since the afternoon, a network anomaly that didn't quite match any pattern I'd seen before, nagging at me the way unsolved things nag at me, which is to say constantly and without mercy. I was on a side street I always cut through because it shaved 4 minutes off the walk. I remember thinking I should stop for food. I remember the particular quality of the air, cooler than it had been, the first real hint of the season changing. Then the world made a sound like a decision, and everything rearranged itself. Not an explosion the way you picture one, more like a pressure, a wrongness, the air doing something air isn't supposed to do. Then I was on the ground and I didn't know how I'd gotten there, and there was heat coming from somewhere to my left, and the ringing in my ears was the only sound in the world. And there was something on my leg. I want to tell you I was afraid. Fear would be the appropriate response to lying in a debris field with a weight pinning your leg and the smell of smoke thickening around you. When what I actually felt was something closer to that flat, analytical calm that descends on me when I'm looking at a broken system. Everything narrowing to variables. What is the problem? What are the factors? What moves next? I think that's just how I'm built. I've never known whether to be grateful for it or unsettled. The problem was the debris on my leg. The variable I hadn't accounted for was the shoes. Expensive. Moving through the wreckage with a calm that was more frightening than any panic would have been. They stopped directly in front of me. I looked up and there was a man crouching into my line of sight. Not rushing, not performing concern, just arriving at a decision the way I imagined he arrived at all of them. Completely. Without visible conflict, I didn't know his name. I didn't know what he'd ordered that had turned this street into what it was, or how many times he'd stood in wreckage of his own making and felt nothing about it. I knew his eyes, dark, still, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. And I knew his voice, which was very quiet when he turned and spoke one word to the men behind him. Take her. I lost the thread of consciousness somewhere in what followed. The last things I registered before everything went dark, the sound of debris being moved, hands that were practiced and not gentle but not careless either, the smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne, and the strange, fading thought that the city was still going. Somewhere above all of this, traffic, a distant horn, Seoul, completely uninterested, then nothing, then a ceiling I didn't recognize. White. The particular white of a room that someone had decided on deliberately and maintained. I stared at it while my brain ran its startup sequence. Location, unknown. Body, horizontal. Time, unclear. Left leg. There it was, the information arriving before I was ready for it. A deep structural ache that I understood immediately was not the kind of pain that resolves. There are pains you have and pains you acquire. This one had moved in and was already rearranging the furniture. A doctor I'd never seen was checking my pulse with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this in rooms like this many times before. He didn't explain himself. I didn't ask him to. We had a mutual understanding. His job was the body in front of him. Mine was everything else. The room was spare, clean, a window with blinds mostly down, enough light to see by. In a chair, a table, a door with a lock I could hear from the inside, and a laptop sitting open on the counter. That detail I cataloged and set aside. Either it was careless or it was something else, and nothing else about this room suggested careless. I didn't have enough information yet to know which. The door opened. A man walked in who was not the man from the wreckage. Compact, watchful, with the energy of someone whose entire professional existence was organized around anticipating threats. He looked at me like a problem he'd been handed without being consulted. His name was Soo-hyun. I wouldn't be contacted and couldn't make contact. I shouldn't ask questions. I would be compensated when the situation stabilized, which told me two things before he'd finished the sentence. There was money, and the situation was not currently stable. He delivered all of this in the tone of someone reciting terms they'd recited before. Understood, I said. He looked at me for a beat longer than necessary, like my lack of hysteria was itself a kind of data he wasn't sure how to process. Then he left. 40 minutes later, the door opened again, and this time I knew before he was fully in the room. Something about the way the sounds outside the door had changed. Soo-hyun's voice, audible through it moments before, stopping mid-sentence. The particular quality of a space acknowledging that the person who matters has arrived. He was taller than the wreckage had allowed me to register. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me, and I looked back at him, and neither of us spoke for a moment. His face was difficult, not blank, controlled. And in the way that suggests control is a decision made long ago and maintained through daily practice, the way an athlete maintains a technique until it becomes invisible even to themselves. He told me I would be compensated, that I would be kept safe, that I would be returned home when the situation allowed. Each sentence delivered with the precision of a man who had reviewed these terms in his head before entering the room. He did not apologize. I noted that. How long? I asked. He didn't know. No hedging, no comfort, just the honest answer. I filed it. He left. The lock turned. I waited until his footsteps had fully disappeared down whatever corridor existed on the other side of that door. Then I exhaled, for what felt like the first time since the pavement. Then I looked at the laptop. I am not built for stillness. And that's the most honest way to describe what the next 24 hours looked like from the inside. My body was pinned, leg braced, mobility reduced to careful negotiations between the bed and the chair and the narrow strip of floor I could manage without too much consequence. But my mind doesn't have an off switch, and when it can't move outward, it moves inward and starts taking things apart. I mapped the safehouse from what I could observe without touching anything I shouldn't. Network traffic through the router visible on the shelf. The rhythm of it told me how many active devices. The frequency of pings told me something about check-in intervals. The pattern of heavier traffic in 30-minute windows told me shift rotations. The the personnel by sound, how many distinct sets of footsteps, how they moved. Now which ones paused outside my door and which ones didn't. The way Soo-yeon's phone lit up differently depending on who was calling. Same device, different urgency gradient, which meant a contact hierarchy, which meant an organization with actual structure. And the laptop. I didn't touch it the first day. I observed what I could see on the screen from the chair across the room, and I turned it over in my head the way I turn over every system I encounter. What is it? How does it work? Where are the edges? Where are the seams? It was a financial dashboard, encrypted routing tables, numbers moving in what was meant to look like natural variance. It didn't look like natural variance to me. By the second day, I was certain. Someone was bleeding this organization, not clumsily. The construction was skilled, patient, or the kind of work that only gets made by someone who understands both the technical architecture and the human habits of the people managing it. They'd built the leak to disappear into noise, the kind of discrepancy that gets attributed to administrative error and never looked at twice. By my estimate, it had been running 8 months, possibly longer. But they'd made 3 mistakes. Small ones, the kind you make when you've been doing something a long time and started to feel safe doing it. And I recognized the architecture underneath the mistakes. The methodology had a signature, a specific way of structuring the routing layers that I'd encountered once before, in a corporate espionage case 2 years ago. Whoever built this had learned from the same sources I had, which meant I could read it the way you read the handwriting of someone trained by the same teacher. I built the map on paper. Nothing traceable, no device, just the notation system I've been using since graduate school that looks like organized chaos and is actually very precise. I worked through the pain because the alternative was lying still with nothing but the pain, which was worse. I spread the pages on the floor because the table wasn't big enough. I slept there once because moving them felt like interrupting something. When I finished, I sat back and looked at what I'd built and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing understood. Then I looked at it a second time and felt something else entirely. This wasn't just a leak, this was a foundation. Someone had been building something with these resources, and they hadn't finished yet. I should have folded the pages and put them under the mattress and waited for the situation to stabilize the way the controlled man had told me it would. I have never been good at leaving things alone once I understand them. It's a flaw. It is also the thing that makes me very good at my job. On the 3rd day, he came back. I heard the shift before the door opened, Soo-hyun's voice outside losing a register, that particular quality of deference that isn't performed, just present. The difference between how a person speaks when they're the authority in the room and how they speak when they aren't. The lock, the door. He stopped when he saw me on the floor, took in the pages, the notation. The fact that I hadn't tried to hide any of it when I heard him coming. Something moved across his face and then didn't. "You have a leak," I said. "It's been running at least 8 months. Whoever built it knows your systems better than your own people do." The silence that followed was a specific kind, not surprised, more like a man hearing confirmed what he'd been refusing to fully believe. "How do you know what you're looking at?" Not a question, exactly. A test. "Because I've built systems like this," I told him, "and I've broken ones like this. The person who designed your breach learned from the same sources I did, and they made 3 mistakes. He crossed the room. The same quality of movement I'd first registered in the wreckage, that total lack of hesitation, on arriving at decisions and executing them, and crouched down and picked up one of the pages, held it, read it the way you read something you're genuinely trying to understand, not performing comprehension. He understood more than I expected. That told me something. He looked up from the page. "What do you need?" Later, I understood the laptop had been deliberate. A test, not of my technical ability, which he'd presumably assessed before making any decision about me, but of something else. what I'd do with what I found, whether I'd sit on it or bring it forward, whether I was the kind of problem that solved things or the kind that became one. I told him what I needed. What followed was the strangest professional arrangement of my life, and my professional life has never been ordinary. Cleared hardware, controlled access, not full, but real, a proper workspace in a room with better light. The terms were spoken once and not repeated because neither of us were people who needed things repeated. I find the source of the leak. I identify it completely. I leave with full payment and clean documents and a flight home whenever I'm ready for it. The documents mattered because my name had, by that point, almost certainly appeared in the vicinity of a crime scene and a subsequent disappearance, which made my original identity a liability I couldn't travel on. Another consequence of being in the wrong place. Another thing I hadn't asked for and was managing anyway. Soo-hyun thought it was a mistake. I know because I heard him say so through the door, not quietly enough, or perhaps not caring if I heard. His argument was logical and I couldn't fault it. She already knows too much. You're giving her more. If she's a liability, you've just upgraded her. The thinking of a man whose entire function is to identify threats before they become problems. I heard Yoon Sung's response. Quiet even, the voice of someone who had already finished thinking the problem through and arrived somewhere Soo-hyun hadn't caught up to yet. She already knew, he said. The question is what she does with it. I sat with that for a long time. It was the most precise thing he'd said about me, and it told me how his mind worked. He wasn't asking whether to trust me. He was positioning me, deciding what kind of variable I was. Useful and controllable were not the same category to him, and he was still figuring out which one I belonged to. And the honest answer was neither. I didn't tell him that yet. I worked. That part was clean. Cleaner than anything else in that safe house. Cleaner than the questions I was developing about my own judgment. The breach unfolded under my hands like something I could genuinely admire even as I dismantled it. The construction was elegant, disciplined, patient in a way that spoke to someone who understood that the best attacks are the ones that never get named. I found myself almost impressed, which is a feeling I take seriously because it doesn't arrive easily. But there was a detail I kept returning to. 3 mistakes, yes, and one of them wasn't sloppiness. It was haste. Whoever had built this had been working toward a deadline. They needed it finished before something specific happened. I didn't know yet what that something was. And I filed it and kept going. Yoon Sung checked in every day, more than the situation required, more than could be explained by the transaction between us. He would appear in the doorway of the workspace, not entering, not announcing himself, just present in the way that people with a particular kind of authority sometimes are, like gravity, something you feel registering before you locate its source. He asked real questions about the work, not supervisory, actual questions, the kind that come from someone who built the thing being discussed and wants to understand what's wrong with it. He grasped the architecture faster than most people I'd briefed with, twice his exposure time, which meant he'd constructed this organization with a genuine understanding of its technical infrastructure, which meant the breach was personal to him in a way beyond the financial. Someone had gone inside something he'd built and hollowed it out. I understood that kind of violation. I started answering without simplifying. That's a thing I only do with people I've stopped underestimating. I noticed I'd done it. I think he noticed too. The chair appeared on the 4th day, in the workspace, angled toward my desk, close enough for conversation, positioned with enough distance that it wasn't a statement. I don't know who moved it there. I didn't ask. I didn't move it back. Small things accumulated the way they do when you're living in close proximity to someone, and both of you are maintaining the pretense of not paying attention. He brought food without comment, the way you do when you've made a decision but don't want to call it one. And he was always gone before I could attach a meaning to it. I worked through the pain in my leg without mentioning it because mentioning it felt like giving something away. And one morning there was medication on the table that I hadn't requested, and he said nothing about it, and neither did I. I told myself these were the gestures of someone managing an asset carefully. He was a practical man, and I was a useful person in a delicate situation, and that was the entire sum of it. I was doing that thing again, lying to myself. Soo-hyun and I had a conversation about 10 days in that I've thought about since. He brought coffee, the way I actually drink it, which he could only know from paying attention, which meant he'd been paying attention, and sat down across from me without being invited and looked at me with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation and is irritated about having had to. He didn't say, "I was wrong about you." He didn't say, "I've decided to trust you." He asked me, with the careful neutrality of someone who does not ask questions without reasons, whether I'd had cybersecurity work in Seoul before this contract. We talked for 20 minutes about the work, about methodology, about a particular type of financial architecture that we'd both apparently encountered in different contexts and reached similar conclusions about. He was sharp, precise in his thinking in a way I respect regardless of context. When he left, he didn't say anything else. But the way he set the coffee down, without looking with the ease of someone who has decided where things belong, told me that his assessment had changed, that I had moved in his categorization from liability to something he didn't quite have a word for yet. I understood. I was having the same problem with his employer. The night scene, I've decided, is the one I'll always go back to. Not because anything happened, because of what it cost not to let anything happen, and the fact that we both paid it anyway. Late. The safe house in its post-midnight register. That specific quality of quiet where the building is still occupied, but everyone has retreated to their own corners of it. My leg had been building all day, the kind of escalation I'd learned to track but hadn't yet learned to accept, or when I'd been managing it with the focused stubbornness I apply to anything I don't want to deal with, which is, people who know me have noted, a substantial portion of my emotional landscape. I was at my desk. I heard the door, not the lock, because somewhere in the second week the lock had stopped being part of the routine, a change no one had announced and I hadn't asked about, which was itself a kind of answer. And then he was in the room and he looked at my face and he saw it, all of it, the pain and the managing of it, in the way of someone who is very good at reading the things people are trying not to show. He didn't ask if I was all right. That was the first thing I registered. And he didn't do the thing people do where they ask the question they already know the answer to in order to give you the opportunity to perform being fine. He just went and got the medication from wherever he'd been keeping track of it. And the fact that he knew exactly where it was, that he'd been monitoring it, was its own kind of information. And came back and sat down, not the chair by my desk. He pulled the other one, the one from the corner, and set it closer than the desk chair, and sat in it, and there was no pretext between us, no file or screen or work-related reason for proximity. Just the room and the hour and both of us in it. We talked. I keep trying to describe what we talked about and keep arriving at the inadequacy of summaries. The city. What brought me here and what kept me here. I had a question he asked about my work that wasn't about the breach, but about what had drawn me to this field specifically, the forensic end of it, the breaking of things. I told him more than I planned to. He listened the way he does, completely, without the performance of listening, which is rarer than it should be. He told me something about the organization he'd built. Not strategically, not the way you'd tell it to someone you were trying to impress or manage. The way you tell something when you're tired of carrying it alone and the person across from you is the least likely person to use it against you, which is its own paradox. At some point I asked him why he'd pulled me from the wreckage. He went quiet for long enough that I thought the question would go unanswered. Then, I don't know. Now I've been asking myself the same question. It landed the way honest things land when you're not prepared for them. "I'm not afraid of you," I said. He looked at me. Something in his expression moved, tried to close itself, didn't quite manage it. "I know." The words came out quietly, almost to himself. That's the problem. We stayed in that for a while. Neither of us moved. Neither of us did the thing that the hour and the proximity and the particular gravity of the conversation were pulling toward, because we were both, in our different ways, people who don't move toward things without understanding them first, and neither of us understood this yet. He left eventually. The door closed behind him. I noticed, as I had for days now, that there was no sound of a lock. I sat in the room after he was gone and let it have its weight. And then I went back to the screen because that is always what I do. But the problem I was working on was different now, and we both knew it. And that knowledge was going to require its own kind of navigation. I found it on a Tuesday morning. Not the leak. The leak I'd mapped weeks ago. The source. The full shape of it. I sat with the data for a long time before I let myself believe what it was telling me, because the data was telling me something I didn't want to be right about. I ran the cross-references twice, checked the timeline against the financial routing 3 different ways, let myself find every alternative interpretation I could construct, and one by one watch them fail. It wasn't a rival organization. It wasn't an outside actor with a grudge or a financial motive working from the exterior. It was someone inside. Someone who had been inside long enough to understand not just the technical infrastructure, but the human architecture. Who trusted whom, who had access to what, which relationships could be leveraged, which schedules could be predicted, the kind of knowledge that only comes from proximity, from being trusted. And it wasn't just theft. The breach was 2-part. 8 months of resource siphoning, patient, nearly invisible, building a fund towards something. And alongside it, a second channel, intelligence. Precise, timed, carefully selected information being fed to 2 external parties simultaneously. A rival faction and someone inside law enforcement who was not, I was certain, acting in any official capacity. The information being fed wasn't random. It was specific to movement patterns, scheduled data, meeting locations, and it was building a picture. In 48 hours, Yoon-sung Jung was scheduled to attend a meeting, a routine sit-down about a territory boundary dispute flagged in the scheduling data I'd been given access to. I'd seen it, logged it, moved past it as irrelevant to my work, and then I understood what the deadline was. It was not irrelevant. I could see the shape of it from the data the way you can see the shape of a trap before you've stepped in it. The intelligence feeds timing exactly to that meeting, the rival faction's financial activities spiking in the window around it, the law enforcement channel going quiet in a way that meant coordination rather than absence. He was going to walk into a room that had been constructed over 8 months of patient work to be the last room he walked into. The name of the person who had built it was in the data, someone who had been with Yoon-sung from the beginning, long enough to have helped construct the very infrastructure they'd spent 8 months quietly destroying. The kind of person whose betrayal doesn't just cost you resources, it costs you your version of events, the story you'd been telling yourself about who you could trust. I looked at the name for a long time. Then I thought about the transaction, the terms, find the leak, identify the source, take the package, go home, clean, contained. I had done exactly what I'd been asked to do. Everything after my delivery of findings was outside the agreement, outside my responsibility. Went outside the line between professional obligation and the kind of involvement I had spent the last several weeks very carefully pretending I wasn't developing. I thought about the chair beside my desk. I thought about the medication on the table. I thought about, I don't know, I've been asking myself the same question I gave myself 1 hour. Then I went to find him. I told him everything, the full architecture, the 2-part mechanism, the 8 months, the external parties, the timing against the meeting, the name. I told him plainly, without softening any of it, because he was not a man you softened things for, and I had enough respect for him by then to know that. Now I also told him we had less than 48 hours before the intelligence feeds were scheduled to go active, and the pieces the traitor had been moving for months would lock into place. He was very still while I talked, That absolute stillness I'd come to understand as how he processes serious information. The body going quiet to let the mind work at full capacity. He stood in the center of the room and he listened, and his face gave me nothing, which I'd also come to understand was not absence, but containment. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment. "Are you certain?" "Yes." Something happened in the silence after that. I saw it, briefly, a fraction of a second, the fracture in the control he maintained over everything, including his own reactions. Not surprise. Something closer to a grief that had been prepared for and still arrived heavier than expected. The name I'd given him was not a stranger. The betrayal was not abstract. Then it closed. He pulled himself back in with the efficiency of someone who has learned to do that quickly because the cost of staying open is too high. He started thinking. I could see the transition, something shifting behind his eyes from receiving to calculating. And within moments, he was somewhere ahead of the information I'd just given him, already working through what it required. I understood, standing there watching him, what I was actually looking at. Not the man who sat in my workspace asking real questions. Not the man who brought medication without commentary or stayed past midnight because neither of us was ready for the conversation to end. I was looking at all of that, and underneath it, the thing that had kept him alive and in power and feared in a city that does not extend mercy to mistakes. Both of those things were true at the same time. I'd known that, in the way you know things you're not ready to fully examine. Seeing it clearly was different. I stayed. That was a choice I made in that moment, consciously, with full information. I want that on the record, too. He moved fast. Within hours of our conversation, the patterns in the network shifted. I watched the intelligence feeds go dark before their next scheduled transmission. The financial channels redirected. I watched it, and I also watched the spaces in the data where I couldn't see anything, which is where the most important things were happening and which told me nothing except that they were happening. And that was the hardest part. Sitting with what I couldn't see. I'm not built for uncertainty any more than I'm built for stillness, and this was both at once. I had given him everything I had, and now there was nothing left for me to do but watch a network tell me fragments of a story I couldn't fully read. I thought about the 48 hours. I thought about all the places in my mapping where I could have been wrong. I ran the cross-references in my head a fourth time and a fifth, and they came out the same each time, which should have been reassuring and wasn't, because reassurance requires a distance from the stakes that I no longer had. The external parties, the rival faction, the law enforcement contact, handled in ways I understood only from the data's sudden absence, which is its own kind of evidence, of the traitor. I knew from the scheduling system that a meeting was called. I didn't look at what came out of it. Some information I understood I didn't need. Then, sometime in the early hours, the network went quiet the way a wound goes quiet once it's been closed. Steady, resolved, the particular stillness of a system that has been repaired. I had been holding my breath, I realized, for a very long time. I let it go. An hour passed, then the door. Soo-hyun came first. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at me and said nothing. Then, "Good work." 2 words, delivered in the tone of someone for whom those words cost something, which made them land heavier than a longer speech would have. He left before I could respond, which I think was intentional. Then Yoon-sung. He looked like himself, composed, present, or the control back in its proper place, but there was something around the edges of it that the hour was too close to erase entirely. The particular aftermath of doing something you had no choice but to do. He looked at me from the doorway and I looked at him, and the room held something between us that neither of us was going to be the first to name. He came in, set the package on the table, flat, sealed. I knew its contents without opening it. Documents with my name on them, in order. Payment, full, as agreed. contact information for someone who would arrange a clean flight to wherever I decided home was, everything promised, everything clean. He stepped back, gave me the room, gave me the choice, which I understood was not nothing from a man who was accustomed to deciding the outcomes of things. I looked at the package, and I didn't touch it. Outside, Seoul was in its late-night register, not quiet, never fully quiet, but a lower frequency of itself, the city breathing. Rain had started against the window, the particular sound of it that I'd come to know over 8 months, that I associated now with working late and the smell of coffee and the particular light in this room at this hour. "My leg isn't ready for a long flight," I said. I didn't look up from the screen when I said it. "The safehouse is available." He said it almost before I'd finished. We both knew this had nothing to do with my leg. Neither of us said so. The conversation didn't need it. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside my desk, the chair that had been there for weeks, the chair I had never moved back on any of the mornings I'd considered it. I turned back to my screen. He stayed. That was how it started, or how it continued. I've decided I'm not sure the distinction matters. 6 weeks later, I signed a lease on an apartment in Mapo-gu, 3rd floor, south-facing, a desk positioned by the window that gets good light from mid-morning onward. From here, Seoul looks different than it did from the pavement that night. Not indifferent, just large. Large in the way of a place that contains multitudes and has room for one more life being quietly assembled inside it. I built my setup carefully. The way I build everything, methodically, with attention to what I actually need and what I only think I need. Good equipment, a decent chair, enough space to spread work out when the thinking requires it, the kind of ordinary infrastructure that means you've decided somewhere is real. And the work I do now is different from the contract that brought me here. More specific, more interesting. The kind of problems that don't have textbook solutions, brought to me by people who understand the value of someone who can work outside the frame of what's supposed to be possible. I won't say more than that. There are 2 coffee cups on my desk most mornings. There are things I know now about myself, about what I'm capable of feeling, about what I'll walk toward when I've run out of logical reasons to keep my distance, that I didn't know before a side street in a city that doesn't lower its voice for anyone. I am not a woman who was rescued. I am a woman who stayed. There's a difference. It matters. And it was entirely mine.